Good evening and welcome. My name is Mohammed El Sayed, and tonight we're taking a hard look at the stories shaping our world. It's August 3rd, 2025, and the political landscape is shifting under our feet, from Washington, D.C. to Dhaka, from Kinshasa to Moscow. The headlines you see flashing across your screens are more than just words. They represent real-world consequences for millions of people. Tonight, we're going to cut through the noise and get to the heart of what's really happening. We'll be examining the far-reaching impact of a new American trade war, the political firestorms brewing within the Justice Department, and a historic trial that could redefine a nation's future. We're also tracking major transformations on the global stage. We'll look at a crippling crisis in international aid, a defiant Kremlin staring down a sanctions deadline, and a landmark peace agreement that offers a glimmer of hope in a region long plagued by conflict. From the high-stakes diplomacy of the BRICS summit to the powerful grassroots protest movements demanding change across Africa and Asia, the threads of these stories are interconnected. They tell a larger story about power, justice, and the relentless pursuit of a better future. Our goal here is not just to report the news, but to understand it, to connect the dots, and to see the bigger picture. We want to provide the context you need to make sense of these complex and often competing narratives. So stay with us as we go beyond the headlines to explore the key forces and critical turning points that are defining this moment in our shared history. We have a lot to get to. Let's get started. We begin tonight in Washington, where the Trump administration has once again picked up its favorite economic weapon, tariffs. This time, the targets are a diverse group of nations including Brazil, India, Taiwan, and a key neighbor, Canada. The administration cites unfair trade practices and national security concerns, imposing steep new taxes on everything from Brazilian steel and Indian textiles to Taiwanese semiconductors and Canadian lumber. The move has sent shockwaves through global markets, with stock exchanges from Sao Paulo to Mumbai seeing significant downturns as investors brace for the impact of this escalating trade conflict. The targeted nations have already announced their intentions to retaliate, promising their own tariffs on American goods, setting the stage for a tit-for-tat battle that could harm consumers and businesses on all sides. The immediate reaction has been one of deep concern, not just from the nations directly affected, but from global economic bodies like the WTO and the IMF, who warn of a potential slowdown in global growth. Here at home, industry groups are divided. While some domestic producers who compete with these imports have applauded the move, a far larger chorus of manufacturers, farmers, and retailers are sounding the alarm. They rely on these international supply chains and fear that the new costs will either be passed on to American consumers, fueling inflation, or will force them to lay off workers. Despite the market turmoil and the threat of retaliation, the White House remains resolute, though officials have left the door open for future negotiations, holding out the hope that this aggressive posture is merely a prelude to securing new, more favorable trade deals. The political heat is also rising here in Washington, with two separate but related controversies engulfing the Department of Justice. A formal investigation has been launched into the office of Special Prosecutor Jack Smith, the man leading several high-profile federal cases. The probe, initiated by a Congressional Oversight Committee, centers on allegations of potential violations of the Hatch Act, which restricts the political activities of federal employees. Critics of the special prosecutor claim his office has engaged in partisan behavior, while his defenders argue this is a politically motivated attempt to undermine ongoing investigations and discredit the judicial process itself. The inquiry is looking into communications and public statements made by members of Smith's team, creating a tense standoff between Congress and the DOJ. Adding fuel to this fire is a second parallel investigation into a series of damaging leaks that have emerged from within the Justice Department over the past several months. Sensitive information related to ongoing cases has found its way to the press, prompting an internal probe to identify the source. The situation grew even more contentious last week with the abrupt dismissal of a senior labor market analyst from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. The analyst's dismissal came shortly after they had publicly questioned economic data being promoted by the administration. While the official reason given was a breach of protocol, critics allege the firing was retaliatory and part of a broader pattern of pressuring civil servants, linking it to the same climate of political pressure that surrounds the Jack Smith investigation. Tomorrow, in Dhaka, a trial with profound implications for the future of Bangladesh is set to begin. Former Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina will face a panel of judges on a slate of serious charges, including corruption, abuse of power, and crimes against humanity. These charges stem from her long tenure in office, which ended dramatically during the July Revolution of 2024. That revolution saw millions take to the streets in a massive youth-led uprising that ultimately led to the collapse of her government. The provisional government that has since taken power has made this trial a centerpiece of its agenda, promising accountability and a break from the country's turbulent political past. The trial is, to put it mildly, a political powder keg. Supporters of Sheikh Hasina and her Awami League party claim it is nothing more than a show trial, a form of victor's justice orchestrated by their political rivals to permanently remove her from the political landscape. They point to the speed of the proceedings and the nature of the evidence as proof of a predetermined outcome. On the other hand, victims of alleged human rights abuses, opposition figures, and the leaders of last year's revolution insist this is a necessary step toward justice and reconciliation. They argue that for Bangladesh to move forward, it must confront the alleged excesses of the past. The international community is watching closely, with human rights organizations calling for a fair and transparent process, one that could either set a new standard for accountability or plunge the nation back into a cycle of political retribution. A devastating and largely unseen crisis is unfolding in the global humanitarian sector. A new report from a consortium of international NGOs reveals a staggering $56 billion shortfall in committed international aid for this year. This isn't just a number on a spreadsheet, it represents canceled food programs, shuttered health clinics, and abandoned refugee support services in the world's most vulnerable regions, from the Horn of Africa to war-torn Yemen. A significant portion of this gap is attributed to the United States, which has dramatically scaled back its foreign aid commitments as part of its America First budget reallocation, redirecting funds towards domestic priorities and military spending. The consequences are dire, with aid organizations on the ground describing a desperate situation where they are forced to make impossible choices about who receives life-saving assistance and who goes without. In response to this vacuum, a handful of other nations are attempting to step up. Spain, Ireland, and South Korea in particular have announced significant increases in their humanitarian budgets, forming a coalition to try and mitigate the damage. However, officials from these countries privately admit that their combined efforts, while noble, are simply not enough to fill the massive void left by the U.S. pullback. The situation has prompted urgent calls for new funding models and a global summit to address what many are now calling a catastrophic failure of the international community's safety net. Turning now to Eastern Europe, where the Kremlin is showing no signs of backing down. With a critical U.S. sanctions deadline fast approaching, Russian President Vladimir Putin delivered a defiant speech today, vowing that Russia will not be intimidated and will continue its military operations in Ukraine until all strategic objectives are met. His rhetoric comes as fighting intensifies along the Eastern Front, particularly around the besieged city of Kharkiv, where Russian forces have launched a renewed offensive. Ukrainian officials report heavy shelling and desperate battles for control of key villages surrounding the city, underscoring the high human cost of this protracted conflict. The looming sanctions are the most punitive, yet proposed by Washington, designed to completely sever Russia's remaining major banks from the global financial system and target its energy sector more directly than ever before. The deadline is set for the end of this month, and it's intended to be the ultimate economic pressure point to force Moscow to the negotiating table. However, Putin's speech today suggests the strategy may be backfiring, instead hardening Russia's resolve. He framed the sanctions as an act of economic warfare by the West and called for national unity in the face of foreign aggression. As the clock ticks down, the world watches to see if this economic ultimatum will lead to de-escalation or simply deepen the chasm between Russia and the West. In a rare piece of good news from a region long defined by conflict, a historic peace agreement has been signed between the Democratic Republic of the Congo and Rwanda. The accord, brokered by the African Union and finalized in July after months of tense negotiations, establishes an immediate ceasefire and a roadmap for de-escalation along their volatile border. For years, the two nations have been locked in a proxy war, with the DRC accusing Rwanda of supporting the powerful M23 rebel group operating in its eastern provinces. This agreement represents the most significant diplomatic breakthrough in over a decade, and has been met with cautious optimism across the continent. International partners, including the European Union and several African nations, have pledged financial and logistical support to help implement the terms of the deal, which includes joint border patrols and a disarmament program. However, significant concerns remain. The most pressing issue is that several powerful rebel and militia groups, including key factions of the M23, were not party to the agreement and have not yet agreed to lay down their arms. Their participation is critical for any lasting peace. Human rights groups are also urging caution, emphasizing that true peace requires not just a ceasefire, but also justice and accountability for the countless atrocities committed against civilians. The next few months will be crucial in determining whether this piece of paper can be translated into a durable peace on the ground. Shifting our focus to geopolitics and the global economy, the 17th BRICS summit concluded today in Johannesburg, South Africa. The summit, themed Cooperation for Inclusive Multilateralism, brought together the leaders of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, along with the bloc's newer members. A central focus of this year's discussions was the regulation and collaborative development of artificial intelligence. The members issued a joint declaration calling for a more equitable global framework for AI governance, one that they argue should not be dominated by Western nations and corporations. They pledged to pool resources for research and create a shared AI development platform. Beyond technology, the summit heavily emphasized the importance of strengthening South-South cooperation as a counterbalance to traditional Western-led institutions. The leaders discussed expanding the use of local currencies in trade between member nations to reduce their reliance on the US dollar, and they reviewed the progress of projects funded by the New Development Bank, the bloc's alternative to the World Bank and IMF. As the summit wrapped up, the presidency of the bloc was formally handed over to India, which will host the 18th summit next year. Indian Prime Minister Modi stated his country's tenure would focus on sustainable development, digital public infrastructure, and further expanding the bloc's influence on the world stage. Finally tonight, we turn to the powerful protest movements that continue to demand change across two continents. In West Africa, the streets of Bamako, Mali, have once again been filled with demonstrators calling for the ruling military junta to set a clear and immediate timeline for a return to civilian rule. The protests, which have been growing in size and intensity, reflect a deep public frustration with the junta's repeated postponement of elections and its tightening grip on power. The regional bloc, ECOWAS, is threatening further sanctions if a democratic transition plan is not presented soon, adding external pressure to the growing internal dissent. Meanwhile, in South Asia, two significant protest movements are challenging their governments. In Pakistan's vast and resource-rich Balochistan province, a Long March protest is gaining momentum. Demonstrators are demanding an end to enforced disappearances and extrajudicial killings, and they are calling for greater control over the province's natural resources. The movement has largely been ignored by mainstream Pakistani media, but its persistence is creating a significant challenge for Islamabad. In neighboring Nepal, thousands of young people have taken to the streets of Kathmandu to protest government corruption and a lack of economic opportunities, a movement that echoes the successful youth-led revolution we saw in Bangladesh last year, highlighting a growing trend of youth-led activism across the region. And that's our roundup for tonight. We've covered a lot of ground, from the economic tremors of a new trade war to the delicate diplomatic dance for peace in Central Africa, from the halls of justice in Washington and Dhaka to the streets where ordinary people are demanding to be heard. Each of these stories is complex, with deep roots and consequences that will continue to unfold in the days and weeks to come. The world doesn't stand still, and the first draft of history is being written every single moment. It's easy to feel overwhelmed by the sheer volume of information, but staying informed is more critical than ever. Understanding these global events is key to understanding our own place in the world. The connections between a policy decision in one capital and the price of goods in your local store, or between a protest movement half a world away and the universal desire for dignity and justice, are very real. We've only scratched the surface on many of these topics tonight. Perhaps you want to know more about the specific technologies at the heart of the US tariffs, or the history behind the conflict in eastern Congo, or the specific demands of the protesters in Balochistan. If there's any particular story or region you'd like us to take a deeper dive into in a future video, please let us know in the comments below. Your curiosity and engagement help shape this conversation. We believe in keeping you informed and will continue to track these developments. Thank you for watching. If you found this report valuable, please consider subscribing and turning on notifications so you don't miss our next update.